Hello and welcome back to Drilled. I'm Amy Westervelt. We have a new season coming up for you in April, and in the meantime, we'll be bringing you a few bonus episodes. Today, I'm joined by our new senior global climate justice reporter, Nina Lakhani, who has special insight into the story of Berta Cáceres. This week marks the 10-year anniversary of Berta's assassination. She was an Indigenous leader in Honduras, and it's been proven that the dam company building the dam she was protesting orchestrated a hit on her with the help of various hitmen, government officials, police, etc. It was a horrific ordeal for Berta's family, for the whole movement in Honduras. And it also raised the profile of just how dangerous it was to be an environmental activist in Honduras. Unfortunately, in those 10 years since her death, it has not gotten any better. And Nina did a deep dive on what's been going on in those 10 years, what it looks like now, and what the lasting impact of Berta's work was. Nina also wrote an entire book on Berta's story. It's called Who Killed Berta Cáceres. It's really, really excellent and has all of the receipts on this whole wild story. So Nina's going to walk us through that story and what's been going on in the decade since all of that happened in this episode today. That's coming up after this quick break. So, Nina, you wrote a whole book about Berta, and I knew of her and her work before you started working on that book as well. What was she like as a person and a leader, and what was so charismatic about her that she posed such a threat to these industries?
Berta Cáceres was a unique leader. She had this really incredible capacity to explain local struggles in regional and global economic and political sorts of terms. And she could communicate with people from all different sort of walks of life. So she was as comfortable in a sort of rural community as she was talking to members of Congress in the US. She wasn't a person that had any formal education. She had 4 kids, very young, but she was, a real sponge. She traveled internationally. She spent a lot of time with Indigenous communities in land and environmental struggles around the world. And she was just really, really smart. She was a political strategist, and she had this ability to unite communities, which is really unusual in the social movement. People sort of have their little fiefdoms in a way, but she could bring together the campesinos with students. She could bring together feminists with unionists. And I think this ability to bring people together, as well as her really sort of very charismatic communication style. She had this ability to convince, to really explain things to people that the elites, the political and economic elites, found really threatening. Yeah. And she could do this intellectually. She was very good with words, but she was a person that loved action. She loved nothing more than being at protests, organising civil disobedience. She was a pacifist. Her organisation was a non-violent grassroots organisation. But I think just this ability to be comfortable and powerful and convincing, really in so many different spaces, among so many different sort of movements, really was a threat to the status quo in Honduras.
Yeah. How did her work first come on your radar? You were reporting in Central America when she was active. What did you first kind of see her do?
I met her in 2013 during my first trip to Honduras. I went for what were meant to be the first legal elections after the 2009 coup. And so I went on a reporting trip and I met her in Tegucigalpa in the capital, where she was participating in a press conference to international observers who'd come for the election. And she was warning them with such clarity that these were not going to be free and fair elections, but the social movement was being repressed. that there was literally a hit list circulating with the names of social leaders, including her, around the country who were being targeted. I mean, and when I got to Tegucigalpa, I mean, I was living in Mexico at the time, and I'd been to other Central American countries, but the level of militarization was like nothing I'd seen before. It looked like a war zone. So I met her there, and I asked her for an interview. At that time, she was on the lam. There was an arrest warrant out for her on bogus criminal charges related to her leadership in this opposition of this internationally funded dam called Aguas Arca. And at the time, her and 2 colleagues had arrest warrants against them. And so she was sleeping in different places every night. Wow. The International at that point had said that if they were arrested, they would consider them prisoners of conscience because it would be completely arbitrary and politically motivated. But she invited me to go to La Esperanza, which is the town in Western Honduras where she lived and she died. And so I went there a couple of days later, and I did my only interview with her. That was the only time I got to interview her. Wow. You know, and she just laid out very, very clearly. I mean, the situation was like in Honduras. For her personally, for her family, I mean, the threats that they faced. At that point, 3 of her children were studying outside of the country because of the threats that the whole family faced. And she described to me with a real sort of sadness what it was like to not be able to go to the river that the Lenca people consider sacred because of the arrest warrant, because of the militarization in the community. And I remember really clearly she said to me, look, I'm taking all the measures that I can to protect my life, but when they want to kill me, they will kill me. And wow. And I just remember that hour I spent with her. It was like one of those sort of moments you have as a journalist that are quite life-changing. She was so impressive. She had such like moral and political and ethical clarity, you know, and she knew she had been told to leave the country to safeguard her own life, but she was absolutely determined to stay and to continue fighting for a better future for people of Honduras.
There's this line in your piece where you said that when you heard about her assassination, you thought to yourself, Jesus, if they can kill Berta Cáceres, they can kill anyone. So yeah, just kind of, what was it like hearing that news, and how did you dig into investigating what happened there?
Yeah, I was on vacation at the time when I woke up to various missed calls from my editor at the time saying they've killed Berta. And at the time, she was absolutely the most well-known environmental and sort of social leader in the Americas. She'd been awarded the prestigious Goldman Prize the year previously. She'd only a few months earlier had an audience with the Pope in Rome. And so she was really well known, you know. I remember the US Congress had taken up sort of her case, as had all of the major sort of human rights organizations.
To give you a sense of Berta, here's a short clip of the speech that she gave when she accepted the Goldman Prize in 2015.
Despertemos, humanidad. Ya no hay tiempo. Nuestras conciencias serán sacudidas por el hecho de estar solo contemplando la autodestrucción basada en la depredación capitalista, racista y patriarcal.
Says, wake up, humanity. We're out of time. We must shake our consciences free of the rapacious capitalism, racism, and patriarchy that will only assure our own self-destruction.
And I think it was just so clear to me then that the sense of entitlement and impunity that those who ordered her murder must have felt to carry out that assassination, because there's no way that you could kill someone who was so well known internationally without there being at least a tacit sort of, you know, agreement from people very high up. I arrived in Honduras to La Esperanza, I think about a month after her assassination, where I met her 3 daughters for the first time, her mother, who was such a huge inspiration to her, sort of social and political work, who's 93, by the way, now, and
wow.
still in La Esperanza. And the first piece I wrote then was I interviewed and spoke to many of her colleagues who were with her in those last days and weeks. I went to Rio Blanco, where the dam had been destined and sanctioned to be sort of constructed. And what became really clear to me was that she knew that time was running out. She was under surveillance. There were informants everywhere, and she'd been making plans. You know, she'd shared the ability to sign checks, for example, with other people in the organization. She'd said goodbye to one of her daughters a couple of days earlier, who was on their way back to Argentina. And the goodbye felt like something more than just a normal see you soon. So I think she knew her time was running out. And so that was the first piece that I wrote. And then I just started digging, and I was able to get hold of documents that showed that some of the intermediaries who had been paid by the dam company were former army officials who had received training by the US at different points in their career, and also a young soldier from one of the special forces who went AWOL a few weeks after her murder. Wow. Because he had been in a unit that had been passed around this hit list, in which there was a name and personal details of multiple social and community leaders. Some of them had an X through them who had already been neutralized, and Berta's name was on that list. And so he went AWOL and ended up coming to me and talked to me about this hit list. He at the time remembered a lot of the training, like really awful training that he had as a young soldier, how there'd been military trainers from Israel, from Colombia, from other countries there, and was just really frightened. And he had to leave the country. He's never been able to go back to the country since, you know. And as I wrote those pieces, I became a target myself. The Honduran ambassador in UK wrote complaints asking for stories to be sort of retracted. The US ambassador in Honduras at the time launched a campaign to discredit me, giving background chats to all sorts of people in Honduras, claiming that I was just this woman who didn't really understand how the armed forces worked. They were forced to at least say they were going to launch an inquiry, because the army units that had this hit list circulated were US trained army units, but they carried out no investigation, didn't speak to any of the people that were in my piece. But I became a target from that point, really. There was like these online campaigns calling me a media terrorist, and really since then, that's 2016, I'd never gone into Honduras by air. I've always gone in over land, which is very difficult. Like, it can take a long time, because I was warned, you know, that I could be stopped coming in. And then I kept investigating the links, and then I was the only journalist, national or international, to attend every day of the first trial, which was for 8 people, 1 who had nothing to do with it, but 7 who between them were the hitmen, the hired assassins, and the intermediaries. And at the start of that trial, I had some really serious threats come my way, some press releases from these fake groups in the Bajo Guan region, which is a really conflicted, dangerous part of Honduras, declaring me persona non grata, linking me to Mexican drug cartels, calling me a terrorist, all sorts of things. And so, yeah, the deeper I dug, the more threats I got, and it's that sort of classic case of knowing that you're hitting the right things because you're really upsetting people. When I was reporting from the trial, the threats came to me from the Aguan, which is this rural sort of region where there's been long-standing land conflicts between African palm magnates and campesinos, which really on the surface have nothing to do with Berta's case. But I think it really showed that this network of economic, political, military, religious elites, the oligarchy that rules Honduras and many, many other sort of countries in Latin America, and control the media, controls the banking sector, control so much of the power in the country, are connected, you know. And so a journalist that was sort of digging into the modus operandi and the structures and systems behind Berta's death posed a threat to all of them.
Yeah. Okay, so walk us through what we know, or what's been made public so far about exactly what happened here, who orchestrated this, and how did the government play into it too?
Well, we know that Berta was assassinated specifically because of her campaign to stop the construction of this internationally financed dam on this river considered sacred by the Lenca people, and that her organising and her leadership had stalled the project, which was impacting the profits of the dam company. We know now from investigations that have happened and from the court cases that have happened so far that the dam company was part of an organised criminal enterprise, which included dam executives, it included the hired hitmen, it included military-trained intermediaries, but it also included state officials and armed forces, both by acts and by omissions. And by that I mean a sort of counter-insurgency campaign to neutralise her that lasted for many years. It included the bogus criminal charges, it included intimidation, it included arming community members against each other, it included attempted bribes, all of those things that were classic counterinsurgency manuals from the Cold War era. They tried with Berta, and when they couldn't silence her, they killed her, right? And this criminal enterprise was involved in all of that in all sorts of ways, from the surveillance to, we know from the evidence that I've seen that the dam company would learn through informants that they were paying in the community when, for example, protests were being planned or when a roadblock was being planned. They would simply have to ask the government to send troops, to send police there to repress the community's peaceful protests. We know that the investigation into her murder at that time, the dam company was continuing to pay police, investigators, journalists to present information that served them. They were receiving images from the crime scene themselves, right, in group chats. And we also know that there was a coordinated plan to blame the murder on Gustavo Castro, who was Berta's friend, who happened to be there and who they thought they had killed, but who survived by feigning death, and so became the only eyewitness, to blame the murder on him, to blame the murder on her colleagues from her organisation, to blame the murder on a romantic partner. All of this was coordinated, and the dam company could not have done that themselves. They didn't do it themselves, right? There were sort of elected officials and state employees at every level, from the police to the prosecutor's office, the Attorney General's office, to the military, to everywhere, that were involved either by acts or omissions in this, right? But this was an organised criminal enterprise that orchestrated the violence against Berta, the Lenca community, then attempted to cover it up. And just one last thing, I mean, the financial institutions involved in this, we also know now that two-thirds of the money that was purported in two international banks, to international development banks, was diverted to pay for the surveillance, the intelligence operations, the informants, the murder itself, the armed security. And the banks involved, well-known international banks, that an utter failure of their own due diligence obligations, right, and their obligations around human rights. Berta wrote to some of these banks back in 2013, pleading with them not to fund this dam because of the repression that was already being orchestrated. People had already been killed. The community had already been terrorised, but they went ahead anyway. So there are the financial institutions that should be held accountable for their role in this, but it stems from their hired hitmen, who, by the way, I interviewed in jail, and it was honestly so sad. These were kids, poor kids, exactly the type of kids that Berta was fighting for a better future for. You know, at least two of them were planning to use the money they get paid to pay a coyote to try and get to the US, right? It's not justifying what they did at all, but they're sort of also victims of this same sort of structural violence that exists in the country.
Right, like ultimately they pulled the trigger, but they're not the ones that planned and orchestrated and all of that. That's so sad.
To underline the US's sort of role in this, you know, I mean, the Two of the intermediaries had received US training at different points of their career. The whistleblower I've already mentioned, he was in this unit called Satruch, which terrorized the Aguan region after the coup and which received lots of US training. And it's worth just naming David Castillo. David Castillo was the president and founder of the dam company. He was an former intelligence officer trained at West Point in New York State. And he is the only one so far to have been convicted of playing a role in masterminding the murder. He was also one of the people convicted of fraud regarding the license of the dam that was sanctioned in this post-coup pro-business sort of environment without due process, without proper consultations, without proper environmental assessments. But yeah, the US made him, right? And he used these intelligence tactics and strategies to try to get close to Berta, to infiltrate the community. And, you know, the US has this long, inglorious history of training some of the worst, people who go on to commit some of the worst sort of human rights abuses in Latin America.
Totally. You spoke with Gustavo Castro recently, too, for this piece. I'm going to play a little bit of tape from him here and then would love to hear more about him as well.
Por un lado, todo eso que tú dices se le extraña un montón, muchísimo, pero al mismo tiempo está tan presente en todos lados que incluso donde no la conocían, la conocen y está muy presente.
He says, on the one hand, it's just as you say, she's enormously missed, but at the same time, she's present in so many ways. Even in places where they didn't know her, they know her now and she's present.
Tell us a little bit about him and his work. What's his story?
Yeah, Gustavo Castro is this really highly regarded Mexican environmentalist and anti-capitalist sort of thinker and organizer. He's the founder and director of an organization called Otros Mundos Chiapas, Other Worlds. And that organization, which worked very closely with Berta and Berta's organization, they organize around environmentally destructive mega projects, but they also do a lot of work around training and helping communities develop local energy alternatives to global capitalist projects. And him and Berta go back years. He has some amazing anecdotes about her. They were in Quebec together in 2001 for the anti-globalization protests. They did a lot of organising against NAFTA together, and so they'd really been in the trenches. And the two organisations would do a little back and forth of training each other and sharing experiences and knowledge. He was in La Esperanza that night. He'd arrived that day, having not seen Berta for quite some time. I mean, after the 2009 coup, Berta, the whole social movement in Honduras, was in this perpetual state of crisis, constantly fighting and struggling to stop these illegally sanctioned projects, right? So they hadn't seen each other for some years. But he'd gone to La Esperanza and he was there because he was going to do several days of workshops for Lenca community members on renewable energy projects. So he'd got there, they'd stayed up late talking, and they were staying with her in her house, and they'd just both gone to bed. They knew he was there, but we know from the evidence, from the trials and from like various sort of phone tapping documents and so forth, that there had been reconnaissance missions. The ex-military sort of officers that had been paid as intermediaries had conducted reconnaissance missions, so they knew he was there. And in fact, there was 4 assassins, like one who stayed in the car and 3 who went to the house. One shot Berta and the other shot, and another shot Gustavo, and they shot him in the face, and it hit his ear, and so he was bleeding a lot because it was like, and so he just stopped, he just lay down and pretended to be dead, and they thought he was dead. So he survived an assassination attempt, right? And then stayed still and quiet until he was sure everyone had gone, and then tried to get help. And it took him hours to raise anybody. He finally managed to get in touch with people in Mexico, who got in touch with people in Honduras, who sent help. And it's important to think that when people called for help, they absolutely did not call the police, right? Because they knew they weren't to be trusted. And so he was sort of whisked away by members of COPIN, but then spent this almost a month trapped in Honduras as they tried to pin the crime on him. They took his boots to test for evidence. I mean, they did.
Wow.
There was just this concerted effort, and he actually ended up having to take refuge in an embassy because they were trying to arrest him.
Wow.
I remember interviewing his lawyer at the time and doing a story, and when he was eventually allowed to leave and go back to Mexico, him and his family ended up spending 2 years in exile in Spain because they didn't feel safe in Mexico either.
Yeah, too close.
I think, too close, yeah. I mean, I think all of that personally has obviously had this huge impact on his physical well-being, on his psychological well-being. When I spoke to him just a week or two ago, saying it's only now, little by little, that he's sort of reading the court files. It's just been too difficult, and he's just realizing how close it was that he could have ended up in jail for this, right? It was so close that he really escaped with his liberty. And I think the other thing you say is that for him, that all of that sort of personal trauma, but for him and many people in the social movement, her assassination, her loss was a huge hit to the whole social movement. They've spent years really focused on demanding justice for Berta, right? And trying to recuperate and refocus. And I mean, it was a huge crisis that had a lot of the work that him and Berta had initiated regionally. They had all of these regional sort of meetings where groups different organizations would come together and they would plan and strategize across the region. They've only just restarted those a couple of years.
Yeah, I thought that was so interesting and important reading your piece. Because sometimes I think, because at least Gustavo wasn't arrested, and we do know that it was the dam company and the government, and there's been some accountability. Some people have gone to jail, things like that. People will be like, oh, okay, the social movement fought back. And yes, in some ways that's true, but it creates this vacuum, not just of that leadership, but then so much time being spent dealing with the impact of that takes away from all of the other work that they were doing for so long. Okay, speaking of accountability, you mentioned David Castillo. Who else has been tried or imprisoned or fined or whatever for their role in this?
So far, 8 people have been convicted of participating in the murder. David Castillo is the most senior of those. The other 7 are the hired assassins and the intermediaries. At least 2 of them had direct links to the dam company. One police officer was recently convicted of tampering with the crime scene and tampering with evidence. And that, for Honduras, that's honestly nothing short of a miracle. I mean, Berta is among almost 100 land and environmental defenders that have been murdered in the last 10 years. And there's been no accountability for any of those people. Right. So it's a small miracle in a way. And it's really thanks to who she was, right? The fact that her murder triggered this international outrage, but really thanks to the persistence of her 4 children, of her organisation, of the people who knew and who loved her, right, who have never stopped demanding justice. I remember when I went to La Esperanza a month after her murder and I met her daughters, and 2 of them said to me, they were in their early 20s at the time, and they said to me, we know that it's on us to get justice for our mother, that the state is not going to do it, that we are now going to dedicate our lives to doing that. And they have, right? And so there's been a huge amount achieved, and there's also been 3 people were convicted for the fraud around the dam concession itself. But there is so many people and so many institutions that have not been investigated. To name a couple, the dam company, the financial manager was a man called Daniel Atalamidens. He and David ran the dam company, did all the day-to-day operations. There's been an arrest warrant out for him for 2.5 years. He was involved with David in diverting the funds, in paying the informants, in paying the assassins, all of those things. He has not been arrested. I mean, and the fact it took 8 years to even issue that arrest warrant is an absolute travesty of justice. An investigation by independent experts that was supported by the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights recently published a 500-page report in which they talk about all the different sort of levels of accountability that remain. The shareholders of the dam company who were in the group chats when the violence and the repression and the illegal payments were being organised, right, who either knew or should have known. The government officials, the institutions, the armed forces that participated in the violence before, during and after her murder have never been investigated, right? You know, one of the things that strikes me as most sort of, I guess, emblematic of this is that the dam licence, despite there being convictions around the fraud in that licence, has never been revoked. Indigenous communities across the country and other rural communities continue to face huge obstacles in obtaining community collective land titles, which means that they are very vulnerable to the terrible laws that exist in Honduras, where, you know, a old person can come along and lay claim to a piece of land in which there isn't a land title. And so that constant threat lingers over the community even to this day.
But I think it makes sense now to talk about Garifuna and Miriam. So like that, to me, that's just such a classic example of this, that there was this 2015 Inter-America
Court of Human Rights
that like said, yes, the government illegally allowed all of this development on these people's land. They should have the land returned to them or be compensated, whatever. And then, you know, what has happened in the meantime. So yeah, can you talk a little bit about that? And then I want to play some tape from Miriam, who was Berta's friend and is fighting that fight now.
Yeah, Miriam Miranda, I mean, another extraordinary woman, an extraordinary Indigenous leader. Her and Berta were best friends. They were comrades, they were sort of sisters in the struggle. Both were targets of misogynist, racist smear campaigns. They were called bad mothers, they were called anti-development, but they always had each other. They were together everywhere. And I think Berta's loss has been, you know, no one in the movement has felt it as much as Miriam has. I think just this fear, this constant fear that she could be next, and it's a well-founded fear. She has received so many different threats, has really sort of caused her to retreat a lot from the public work that she was doing, as she remains sort of an incredible leader. So I spoke to her the other day, and she was very clear that two events mark the Indigenous and land struggles in Honduras in the last decade. One is the murder of her friend, and the other was this Inter-American Court landmark sentence at the end of 2015, which found that the state of Honduras had violated the human rights and the ancestral territorial rights of the Garifuna people on the north coast of Honduras in a community called Triunfo de la Cruz, and later in Punta Gorda as well. And that the state of Honduras was ordered to return the land, pay whatever compensation be necessary to the people who were going to lose land, to apologise and to make sure these things never happened again, right? 10 years on, that land has not been returned. More land, more ancestral land has been taken, you know, has been sold to private investors. Some of the people who have bought this land illegally include government officials from every single party that exists in the country. There has been ongoing development and encroachment, and those Garifuna leaders who have been trying to get the state to comply with this sentence have been disappeared, they've been killed, they've been forced into exile, they've been forced to migrate to the US or elsewhere. And it's this perpetual state of violence and land grabs that have continued. I actually spoke to a local leader in Triunfo de la Cruz yesterday, a woman called Francis, and on the 10th anniversary of the court sentence, so that was the end of last year, they're so sick, fed up of non-compliance with the state that they've decided to take matters into their own hand and have started to reoccupy peacefully the land that is theirs, that the highest court in the continent has ruled to be their ancestral land. And the result has been that they have been criminalised. They are now facing criminal charges that if found guilty, they could face up to 9 years in prison, right? But she said to me that this is our land. We are not going to give up on our land, and we're going to keep occupying it. But this is constant state of fear and struggle. And I think the Garifuna community and the Lenca community because of who Miriam and Berta always worked so closely together, and their struggles, there's a lot of parallels between the two.
It was so interesting to me that you described what's happening there, and that people because so many of the Indigenous people don't have like hard copy land titles, that these people can come in and be like, oh, this is my land. And then if you can't prove that you own it with this title, then you don't have a leg to stand on, and I get to just take this land. It's wild, absolutely wild.
The onus is on communities who have lived on the land for decades, if not centuries. The onus is on them then to prove that they are not invaders.
Yes.
And because of this absolutely outrageous reform to the penal code in 2020, which was condemned by every single international law expert that you can imagine, a business person, someone who wants a piece of land, can a piece of land in their name or the name of anyone at the land registry, take it to a court and say, hey, this is my land and is invaded. And the community there can be evicted within 48 hours. They're called express evictions. And then, so you have communities across the country just living in shacks on the side of the road because they have been turfed off their land, where they have crops, where they have, ancestral rights. It's a completely outrageous,
illegal. We kind of touched on this a little bit, but, you had the coup, then post-coup, you had this very pro-business narco government. And then you had this brief period of the Libre Party that seemed like they were going in the right direction, but didn't make any changes to sort of the major structural foundations of this stuff. So they didn't enforce this ruling from the regional court either, right? So I want to play a little bit of tape from this woman, Karen Spring, that you spoke with about this, because I thought she had this great line about how it doesn't matter who's in charge. The problem is endemic, and it's also connected to neoliberal capitalism globally. And then I want to talk a little bit about what the Libre Party was and why it didn't sort of work to change things.
It's systemic. It doesn't matter who's in power in Honduras or who's in the presidential palace or the Supreme Court or the public prosecutor's office. It's systemic. It's part of how the system functions. The neoliberal economic system, it needs impunity, it needs corruption, it needs political actors to be involved in organized crime in order to advance in countries like Honduras and many others around the world. This is how the system is supposed to work, and it's very unfortunate.
Karen Spring is co-coordinator of the Honduras Solidarity Project. She mobilized help on the night of Berta's murder. Okay, so Nina, what was and is the Libre Party, and what did they try to do?
Yeah, until the coup, Honduras, in its sort of very brief democratic sort of period of 20, 25 years, it was a two-party system, right? The National Party and the Liberal Party, which honestly resembled a lot the Democrats and the Republicans, right? There was very little between them in many things. There were powerful elites running two parties. The Liberal Party was ostensibly better than the National Party when it came to human rights and sort of some social issues, but there wasn't that much between them. The coup happened, which was orchestrated mostly by the National Party and their economic, sort of military, religious allies, but with some Liberal Party members around the fringes too. And then, in the wake of that, in the coming years, the Libre Party is born really out of the resistance to the coup, right? So it includes academics, unionists, social movements, all of those things, but also has veteran politicians from the Liberal Party, right? Including Manuel Zelaya, who was the Liberal Party president who was deposed in the coup, right? And among many others. And a lot of these Liberal Party politicians have their own connections to land violations, alleged connections to organised crime and other types of wrongdoing, right? But it does rise out of the social movement, and Manuel Zelaya would have liked to have been president again, but he was a man that the US could not do business with, right? And there was no way they were ever going to allow him to run for president again. So his wife, former First Lady Xiomara Castro, runs for president and wins at the end of 2021 and comes into power in 2022. It definitely brought hope, right? Being completely cynical. I don't know how much Xiomara Castro wanted to be president, and I think lots of evidence that I saw, her husband was running a lot of things in the background. But it did bring hope. And one of the things that I think people were really sort of energized about at the beginning was that she announced these sort of priority investigations, these commissions, which included a commission into the Garifuna land issues, into the implementation of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights sentence, into Aguan land conflicts, into Berta's case, for example. We learned some really important things. There was good steps taken, but at the end of the day, it's about action, right? And they failed to deliver transformative action, structural changes. The people I spoke to, the analysts I spoke to, would say that all of the commissions inquiries they set up have to be thought of as failures because they did not achieve structural changes. But interestingly, like Honduras, like Latin America in general, social movements are very active. Despite the huge risks that they face, people go out onto the streets, they protest, they demand better. And that really didn't happen during the Libre government, right? And I think partly people say it's because everyone was exhausted after 13 years of National Party abuses. I think people also didn't want to close the door to dialogue with the government. I think people felt reassured because so many people from the resistance ended up in government. And so they didn't have that pressure on the streets, which I think is really important. And so I think, you know, there was some positive changes. There was definitely fewer land grabs. There were fewer land and environmental activists murdered. But you know, nowhere near enough. And certainly they cannot claim that they delivered on their promises.
It's a good lesson for American politics. I feel like this happens all the time where, I mean, we saw it in the like Trump to Biden to Trump cycle in the US too, where people really got galvanized around just getting rid of this one administration and not the structural things underneath that were going to continue to be bad. And I mean, there's so much lecturing. I don't know if this was happening in Honduras too, but in the US, there was so much like lecturing of the center left to the left to not criticize. It's like, don't criticize the IRA and don't criticize whatever. And it's like, well, then you end up with no structural change and policies that can easily be chucked out as soon as the next conservative government comes in, which the conservatives seem to know really well. And it sounds like the National Party has learned that lesson as well.
Yeah, I mean, we have the National Party president that governed for 2 terms, Juan Orlando Hernandez, was running a criminal enterprise through the party. Him and his brother, Tony Hernandez, who was a member of Congress, were both convicted in the Southern District of New York of being major drug traffickers and armed traffickers to the US. Juan Orlando Hernandez was sentenced to 45 years in jail in 2024. And at the end of last year, pardoned by Donald Trump, right? And now a Trump-supported National Party candidate has been re-elected into government, a construction magnate, and really the brief respite that the Libre Party sort of provided, despite not making any real major changes, is over. And I think the parallels between what you've just described in the US and Honduras are really important to make, right? Is that actually being on the streets, the public protests are essential to delivering long-term transformational changes, right? Are they enough on their own? No, but without them, it's not possible, right? And so I remember when Biden won, I was living in the US then, and even in the newsroom I was working in, the relief among some people was like, oh my God, we can breathe again. We can just normality again. Is returned. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And you know what? Rights are very hard to fight for, but it's even harder to keep them, right? And I think both these countries can show us that.
Yeah. Okay, I want to talk about Juan Lopez and his assassination in 2024. That was when the Libre Party was still in power, right? So, you know, a very similar situation to Berta happened under this party. Another example of how this is happening regardless of who's in power. But tell me a little bit about who he was and what happened in that situation.
Juan Lopez was a community leader from the Bajo Guan area. He was an evangelical pastor. He was one of the key people who helped organize opposition to this huge polluting iron ore mine that had been sanctioned within a nationally protected forest area where there are sort of really important water sources serving thousands of people in the area. And this mine was owned by a very, very powerful, wealthy couple linked to the National Party. The community is called Guapinol, and he was one of the key leaders in organising that. And the repression against that community that happened during the previous administration, but also during the Liberal administration, was really just like outrageous. 7 people, I think, not Juan, but 7 other leaders were jailed for 2 years without bail for bogus charges. Juan and many others faced criminal charges as well. The community was militarized. They had threats all of the time. But the interesting thing about Juan was that at the time of his murder, he was actually an elected Libre Party official in the city of Tacoma, which is the main city in Niaguan. So he was like a local sort of councillor, and he had been calling out alleged corruption between the mayor, a Libre Party mayor, and organised crime. And he had been calling this out, and he had been investigating these sort of alleged corrupt links to the mine, but also linked to other sort of wrongdoing or organised crime. And he was shot dead coming out outside a church in September 2024. I mean, it was really the most impactful murder of an environmental and land defender since Berta. You know, Juan was much loved, incredible communicator, very well known, and a Libre Party elected official, right? He, like Berta, was meant to be the recipient of protective measures that had been ordered by the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights because of the threats that he was facing. And he was killed anyway. Like with Berta, his case, the case of the Guapinol defenders, was well known by and had been taken up by many different UN experts who, after his death, specifically called out for an independent investigation that looked at the ties between the mining company and the local mayor and the mayor's office in the crime. None of that has happened. So far, 3 alleged assassins have been charged, and their trial is due to start later this year. But none of those who conspired or ordered, paid for this murder there's no evidence have even been investigated. And I've spoken to people who have contacts in the prosecutor's office. The investigation has not proceeded at all. And so really, to this day, if we think about since the coup, I'd say, I don't know, at least 200 land and environmental defenders have either been killed or disappeared in Honduras. And Berta's is by far the case where there has been most accountability. Accountability remains almost impossible. Impunity remains the norm. And I think with Juan's case, what we're seeing is another example of that.
You just started to talk about this connection between what happened with Hernandez and then being convicted and then pardoned by Trump. And then, I don't know, a year later, he is going after Maduro for drug trafficking charges and using it as an excuse to take over Venezuela. So yeah, I mean, you must have been going like, oh my God, there's so many parallels. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the Venezuela piece of this goes back to the coup, actually, right? And so Manuel Zelaya, the Liberal president who was deposed in 2009, when he came into office, he was just like another landowner, right? He'd been involved in lots of logging. He comes from one of the oldest traced Spanish sort of settler families. I mean, but slowly over his mandate, as he became closer to the social movement, right? And he actually became quite close to Chavez, Hugo Chavez at the time, and was buying oil from Venezuela. And the US government at the time, specifically Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, absolutely hated this, right? Loathed Zelaya. who decided to buy Venezuelan oil because energy prices are so disgustingly high, like outrageously high in Honduras because of this sort of mafia monopoly of like the energy sector. When Hillary was standing for president against Trump, I went back and investigated her role in that, and I didn't find any smoking gun of the US involvement in the coup. But I absolutely can say that the US and Hillary Clinton in particular allowed the coup to proceed, and they allowed the post-coup regime to do what it wanted to do because Zelaya was a persona non grata as far as the US was concerned, right? So the Venezuela link goes back to then. Now, fast forward, Juan Orlando Hernandez was pardoned at the end of last year, literally as plans were already underway by the US to illegally depose Maduro. Literally at the same time, Trump was claiming that Maduro and his wife and the Venezuelan regime were part of a drug cartel, which doesn't exist.
I know, that one kills me. Because you can see it. They're like talking about it as though it exists, and then they kind of get a couple of leaders that are friendly to them to repeat this name that this exists. Then.
Well, they claim they were leading the Cartel del Sol. The Cartel del Sol is like this nickname that Venezuelan journalists gave to first Venezuelan military officers, but then anyone from the state who were engaged in allegedly corrupt actions, right? So it doesn't exist as a physical, as a group. Yeah. It's like a loose term to describe corrupt officials. So literally they pardoned this major drug trafficker. I mean, Hernandez unleashed a scale of violence not before seen in Honduras. He deployed the army and the police, created a whole new militarized police force in order to run this criminal enterprise, which, by the way, led to huge amounts of targeted killings of journalists, of defenders, of lawyers, of political opponents, of children, of women, and to hundreds of thousands of Hondurans fleeing the country to immigrate to the US, right? The man responsible for that and for transporting tons and tons and tons of cocaine to the US.
Yeah, the US described it as him making a cocaine highway from Latin America to the US.
Yeah. I mean, Honduras before the coup was not a major player in the cocaine trade, but a couple of years after the coup, around 80% of the cocaine coming from the south was transiting through Honduras. 80%.
Wow.
Right? I mean, the coup, as well as unleashing this sort of pro-business extractive nightmare on the country, it turned Honduras into a major player in the international drug trafficking trade. And the person found guilty by a US jury and sentenced to 45 years was pardoned by Trump weeks before Nicolas Maduro and his wife were illegally abducted from Venezuela and transported to a jail. I mean, the joke here was the bed was still warm. Hernandez left, the bed was still warm when Maduro landed in it.
Wow. Okay, so all of this can be very depressing and disheartening for activists, right? That it's like, man, the more it's always hard. You're never winning, and then when you do win, you up your chances of being assassinated. So let's talk a little bit about the lasting impact that Berta had on the movement. Other than, there was this unintentional negative impact of like there was all this time that was spent on trying to get justice for Berta, and like that took away from other things. But what are some of the things that she helped to put in place that are still there now and maybe coming back to life a little bit now too?
Her family and Copin always say, Berta no murió, se multiplicó. Berta didn't die, she multiplied. And I think that's really true. I mean, honestly, over the last decade, the amount of places that I've been where I've seen murals or slogans like commemorating Berta, friends traveling in places, different continents, send me photos of sort of these, these graffiti or pictures or whatever. I mean, I think that, because of who she was, and because she was so well known internationally, right, in Indigenous movements, in local struggles, in every continent, that she left a mark. Anyone who ever met her has never forgotten her. But now what I find really like incredible, and Gustavo talked a lot about this, is that people who were too young to remember Berta when she was alive, or who never met her, are inspired by her. As just one example, I was contacted by a young Mexican woman a couple of months ago who was she's studying literature in Montreal, and she'd come across my book, which is available in French, right? And she'd read it, and Berta's story inspired her to write a short story, which has now been published in a book. So it's sort of inspired art, it's inspired documentaries, it's inspired social movements, it's inspired sort of grants and educational opportunities. And I think that is, yes, her loss has been huge, and leaders like Berta do not come along very often, and I think we really feel her absence. I mean, every time there's a scandal in Honduras, or before every election, like, I think it's a gut punch for everyone, because you miss her voice, you miss her analysis, you miss her clarity. But who she was and why she's missed so much means that she continues to inspire social movements, activists, leaders around the world. And I think that is real. And I think over the last few years, I think her organisation, COPIM, which is now led by her second eldest daughter, Bertita, has moved from being in this perpetual crisis mode to looking forward, to taking actions, proactive actions, and organising around community land struggles and energy again. And I think some of these sort of regional bodies and conferences and so forth that people just didn't have the time or energy or heart for are back up and running. So I think it's been a really slow process. I think her absence is really... it's still felt really sort of starkly, but I think who she was and her leadership and her clarity, her courage. She said this to me when I interviewed her that one time. She's like, please don't think that I'm not afraid. I am afraid, but this is what I'm meant to be doing. And to me, courage is being afraid and keeping going anyway. And I think her courage is inspiring, and it continues to sort of motivate people and movements around the world today.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the kind of inspiration we all need more of these days. I just want to play some short clips here from the commemoration of Berta's life that happened this week in La Esperanza. Nina gathered these from various friends that were there. First, we're going to hear from Berta's daughter, Laura Zúñiga Cáceres.
Y hoy, a 10 años del asesinato de mi mami, volvemos a decir, no aceptamos la muerte como un sistema que domina el mundo. No aceptamos la violencia, no aceptamos la guerra. Queremos construir sociedades de paz, de ternura, de rebeldía, que puedan crear alternativas de vida.
She says, today, 10 years after the assassination of my mom, we say again that we do not accept death as a system that dominates the world. We do not accept violence. We do not accept war. We want to build peaceful societies of tenderness, of rebellion that can create alternative ways of life. Berta's friend, Lenca leader Rosalina Dominguez, also spoke at the ceremony, telling the crowd, Berta empowered us women to fight for our rights as Indigenous people. We are no longer afraid of the army or police or judges. Berta planted this rebellion, and we continue to advance in her honor. After the ceremony, she talked about her role as women's coordinator for Berta's organization, COPIN.
Para mí, pues, ese papel es muy importante, ser una mujer, sobre el legado de nuestra compañera Berta Cáceres, que eso es lo que ella nos dejó, pues, como mujeres, para poder liderar a las demás compañeras y saber, ¿verdad?, que nosotros las mujeres también tenemos la voz de poder defendernos y protegernos a sí mismas.
She says, for me, that role is very important as a woman, following in the footsteps of our colleague Berta Cáceres, who left us with the legacy that we can lead our fellow women and know that we also have the voice to defend and protect ourselves.